There's perhaps not another cartoon that's as reflective on what it means to be a cartoon than OKKO Let's Be Heroes. Throughout the show, there are various episodes that reflect on the different parts of being an animated series. As from there being an entire episode halfway through the show's first season about the original pilot, to the final episode of the shortened final season partially being about the fact that the show was cut short, OKKO is a series that has no issue getting meta. And while the fact that they do this so frequently might sound like it would get annoying, it's the show's superb set of characters and infinitely off-the-wall humor that allows them to get away with it. And perhaps no episode illustrates all of this as well as their take on a season premiere, the fittingly titled Season 2 opener, Seasons Change, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to dive into 11 minutes of some of the funniest stuff to come out of the show and talk about how, through the context of being a season premiere, OKKO reflects on the concept of change.
There's no going back after a time skip. I don't like it.
Besides just being the most visually stunning of the episode, the first frame of this one, as Rad drives to his first day of work after summer break, also reveals the pun of the title, as not only does this episode mark the change from Season 1 to Season 2, but we're also watching the characters enter the fall. And while we don't quite get to see just how much Rad has changed since we've last seen him at first, outside of his now seemingly orange hands, we do get to see a couple of side characters and their dramatic costume changes as they react to the new Rad, with my favorites being the adorable Farmer Red action and Brandon's hilariously fitting new shirt. But once he does eventually make his way into the bodega, we get a good look at the now orange Rad, something that the helpful text on screen makes more apparent. And in one of my favorite gags of the episode, the camera then pans to where Enid should be, as the audience gets a moment of anticipation for what her summer transformation entailed, and yeah, she's a mime now, in one of my favorite single episode redesigns of any character ever. While Orange Rad pretty much acts the same as Blue Rad, I just love everything about Mime Enid's mannerisms in this episode. I know I'm skipping ahead a bunch, but while this episode does do the obvious mime gags throughout, such as Enid having to unzip her mouth every time she speaks, or leaning against invisible walls, they also just give her a wonderfully weird expression in every single frame. Seriously, when creating this video's thumbnail, I had to combine like 6 different images of Enid because there's not a single close-up of this character in this episode where she isn't making a goofy face. And while this made creating a thumbnail more difficult, it makes watching the episode infinitely better. The bit with Rad and KO clearly not knowing what a mime is and just interpreting Enid's new look as a sad, unfunny clown is great too. Speaking of KO, let's finally get to the big reveal of his new outfit for the season, and he's still the same boy. And while there are a few more meta jokes about this episode's placement as the season premiere, especially with Rad and Enid's explanation of a time skip, the rest of the episode somewhat settles into its reflection on change. And while that wouldn't have made a better title for this video, it does make for the more interesting part of the episode. Speaking of which, from this point on, the episode somewhat splits its runtime into focusing on 2 different parts of the concept, as we get both a comparison of superficial versus genuine change, as well as a comparison of the right versus the wrong way to react to it. To start with the former, after KO freaks out about both of his friends' new looks, each one of them goes into an explanation about their transformations. I really like this bit here, as both Rad and Enid unreliably narrate through their goofy journeys, as they turn accidentally putting on a toxic orange cream in an attempt to tan, and getting distracted and accidentally taking a mime class, into a journey to join a clan of armored warriors and taking an intense jiu-jitsu course, respectively. And while both of these sequences are filled with too many great gags to mention, I think the point of both of them, thematically, is that neither of these characters actually wanted or meant to go through the changes that they did. both of them made a mistake and made it their new identity instead of just admitting that they messed up. Hence why, when their new identities caused them problems in the future, such as not being able to save KO, they both give it up fairly quickly and go back to their old selves. The reason that they were able to literally shed their new versions was because they never really changed. They both just kind of thought they did. This is then immediately juxtaposed by the actual changes towards the tail end of this episode. As while the first 6 or so minutes are more or less parodying the idea of everything changing in between seasons, we do get glimpses towards the two biggest differences for the show's second batch of episodes. The first of which being the fact that Boxmoor is now under new leadership, and the second of which being the fact that KO's mom, Carol, is now dating his boss, Mr. Gar. And while both of these are pretty big changes, the end of the episode makes it clear that, at least during day-to-day life, they simply aren't as life-altering as the characters thought they would be, as they still end up fighting robots, and KO still gets to do all of the stuff that he usually does with his mother, to the point where he didn't even realize that she was dating Mr. Gar until his friends pointed it out to him. Speaking of which, while the episode presents the differences between the superficial and the genuine changes around him, we get to take a look at how KO reacts to both of them. As I mentioned before, KO obviously does not like the new versions of his friends, as after seeing the lack of a Boxmoor box, he drops the hilariously dramatic monologue on screen now. And while this is obviously played as a joke in the episode, I think it's really interesting how the show chooses to portray him as wondering whether or not his life will ever be the same, only for them to end up fighting robots like they always do. This is then juxtaposed by the actual big change for KO in this episode as he learns about his mother's new boyfriend, only after it's been happening for literal months. But despite this enormous change, which obviously does matter in future episodes, KO's summer was still largely the same, as he still ate his breakfast, still played at the beach, still practiced his rocket skating, and still watched the Chip Damage movies, all while still getting loved by his mother, despite the fact that Mr. Gar was now a part of her life too. And that's the point that this episode ends on, as after KO learns that he was the only one of his friends to actually have a meaningful change during the time skip, he's more excited than anything else, in direct contrast to how he reacted earlier in the episode.
Well, hey, looks like I had a pretty cool time skip after all.
In the 2 seasons that follow this episode, KO goes through a bunch of change, as even just by the next season premiere, his life has completely changed from just working at the bodega, and by the end of the show, he's almost a completely different character, complete with a new design to reflect the outcome of the finale. Looking even further ahead, by the end of the time skip that takes place during the final episode, KO's life has changed so drastically that the life he's so afraid of changing in this episode is merely a fading memory. But despite all of this happening, while there is definitely some struggle, he finds himself able to get through it. Even if KO fears that everything in his life is suddenly changing, it's really these slow and subtle changes that ultimately end up creating his new reality. A reality that he finds himself able to adjust to. Throughout its 100+ episodes, every character in OKKO ends up growing as a person, something that is not so subtly represented by the show's leveling system, so obviously all of this growth inevitably brings change. And while resisting it is natural, the best way through it is by accepting the change, just as KO does at the end of the episode. And while there are a bunch of things that I love about this show, I've always been really impressed by their ability to take inherently comedic concepts, such as doing an episode making fun of the typical season premiere, and then turning that into something with genuine meaning, a feat that they do pretty routinely. While Seasons Change is this hilarious episode with some great new designs that they effortlessly weave into 11 minutes of terrific gags, it's the ability to still tell a story about change change and how to deal with it that showcases why OKKO is truly a special show. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to anybody who clicked on this video despite it not being on Adventure Time or Steven Universe, as while it's probably not great for the growth of the channel, I simply love OKKO too much to not talk about it every once in a while. If you want a more effective way than the comments to remind me that I promised a long video about Breezy this week, you can find my Twitter hidden somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week with probably my most controversial upload yet. For real this time. Thanks for watching.